Welcome to the Rocket PD podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of Rocket PD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
Piece, which is we're living in this age of machine learning where adaptability is going to be critical, where we don't know what the jobs are going to look like, where we can't predict the future. And
John Spencer is a renowned PBL expert, college professor, and author of Empower: What Happens When Students Own Their Learning. John has traveled the world meeting with and talking with educators about how to make learning real and relevant for students.
And given that reality, what project-based learning does is it empowers students in the present to prepare them for the future.
On this episode of the Rocket PD podcast, I asked John about the power of project-based learning and design thinking in an AI-driven world. We discuss a process for designing PBL units that are engaging, easy to assess, and closely aligned to academic standards.
So it's that concept of how do we prepare them for this unpredictable world by empowering them through meaningful, authentic project-based learning.
At the end, John shares details about a group he is pulling together to master the art of effective PBL design in classrooms. Stick around to learn more. John, all right. Well, hey, thanks for joining me. I'm so glad to have you today. You know, I know we've been talking a lot in different conversations about this idea of wanting to put students at the center of their learning and what that looks like for schools, and that it looks like different things in different contexts. I was excited to get you on the podcast because I know this is a conversation that a lot of educators are having. I just spent last week in Boston. We were actually all over Massachusetts, as a matter of fact, up and down Cape Cod. And one of the things that kept coming out as we were talking was this idea of giving students more ownership of their learning and what that looks like for educators, things that we can do, practices that we can integrate, this notion that when you free teachers up to spend time engaging with individual students around their challenges and their needs, what that can do for them as a force multiplier in their classrooms. I know, you're big into project-based learning in particular, so I want to talk a little bit about PBL. I think that PBL's been around for a long time, but one of the things that you always say is PBL is actually something that can work for classrooms in the future. And so I want to talk to you about project-based learning, this notion of sort of what it is in your mind and why you think it's positioned to really help educators as they think about the future of education in their classrooms.
Yeah, so if we think about project-based learning, I think it's been relevant for a long time. Like you said, the concept of learning through a project rather than just doing a culminating project at the end and trying to squeeze it in, but really doing a full unit of study, whatever that may be, through a project has been around for a long time. And I think it's been relevant for a long time because what it develops in students is timeless, right? So they're developing these core skills. A lot of schools have these, profiles of a graduate and things like that. They come up with visuals. Those just end up on a poster in a classroom, right? This is really developing those critical skills, the communication, critical thinking, creativity, the adaptability, the ability to collaborate with others. But then at the same time, what it does is it allows you to learn the content at a deeper level. So the information is kind of stickier. You remember more of it over time, and you engage in that deeper learning. So it's been important for a long time, right? And I think that's a key first part, which is it's not just a fad, right? On the other hand, there's the secondary piece, which is we're living in this age of machine learning where adaptability is going to be critical, where we don't know what the jobs are going to look like, where we can't predict the future. And given that reality, what project-based learning does is it empowers students in the present to prepare them for the future. So it's that concept of how do we prepare them for this unpredictable world by empowering them through meaningful, authentic project-based learning.
So what does this look like, John, in the classroom when you start thinking about, if I'm a teacher and I'm an educator, I believe in this, right? The world around us is changing so quickly. We need something that's going to empower students so that they can be functional and productive in that change. Talk to me about what this looks like in the classroom and how it might be different than what we're currently doing.
So I think it's going to vary based on grade level and subject area. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. But in general, what will a project have? It's going to have a meaningful starting place, solving a problem, tackling a big challenge, building empathy with an audience, whatever that starting place will be. That will lead into inquiry, where students are going to be engaging in questions, research. And again, that research could be observational, it could be online research, it could be talking to experts. There's a lot of ways that you can do that research. And then that will lead into a place where they are going to plan and they're going to generate their own ideas. And they're not just following a recipe, they're really creating something original. And that's going to lead into a place where they prototype, whatever that might be. They could be building a system, they could be putting on an event. They're often going to be creating some kind of product, whether it's a physical or digital product. And then you give them that time to revise. And I think what it looks like is it could be, first graders learning about simple machines and designing a more inclusive playground, right? But it could be high school students who are learning all about, ecology and environmental sciences, understanding their local drinking water and why there's been challenges related to toxic algae plumes and relating that to the data in climate. It could be designing a museum in a social studies class, right? There's a lot of different ways that you do it, but the core thing is it's got to have that inquiry, it's got to have that authenticity, it needs to have that student ownership built into it.
Interesting. And I love this notion that these projects that you can design for your classroom, they don't have to stop and end at the classroom door. It seems like many of these projects really can be things that go on to support your local community, to support initiatives that are happening outside of the classroom. Can you talk to me a little bit about sort of the community impact potential of some of this stuff?
Yeah. And so I think when it comes to the community piece, we often have something that occurs in PBL where students will create something and then invite the community in, or maybe bring it out to the community. But some of the coolest projects occur when there's a genuine partnership happening. And so that could mean that they're interviewing people who are going to be their core audience. It could be that they're getting user feedback as a part of the revision process. It could be that they co-create and co-plan with members of the community. And they actually invite them into that planning process as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. And the core idea is, what does it mean to connect authentically with your community? One of my favorite examples was really simple. It was rural Nebraska, right? So rural school district, Nebraska, PBL. And a teacher friend of mine did a math board game, and they were learning about probability and permutations and those things in fifth grade. I think actually it was fourth grade. And instead of just inviting families for a family night, which is what a lot of schools will do, which is a great thing to do, they actually built empathy with members of their community who were in a nursing home and who were in like a senior center. Now, this is small town, it's rural, but yep. It was powerful. And they asked for feedback, and they actually turned that math project into an oral history project as well. And they were engaged in writing, they were engaged in research and reading. They put together this interactive timeline. And so this teacher was open to the notion of seeing where the project led them.
That's really cool. I know you have a deep personal connection to project-based learning. I know that this is something that really changed your life, and kind of is what made you want to go into education. You've now been all over the world
Yeah.
talking about this, but tell me a little bit about your origin story, right, and how this whole thing started for you, because I think people will love to hear it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've heard me tell this story, Corey. So
Sure.
my first ever true project was in the 8th grade. Now, I had done school projects that were like crafts. We did a sugar cube mission project for California, for example. But this was the first time I had true ownership in the process and voice and choice. And it was something called a National History Day project. And I remember at first I hated it. I hated having choice. I didn't know what to do. I remember walking up to my teachers and saying, which topic do you want me to choose? And there were two teachers. Mr. Darrow said, why don't you play around for a couple weeks and figure out narrow it down at that point? And I thought, that is way too messy and inefficient. And so then I went to Mrs. Smoot and I said, what topic do you want me to do? And she said, what's going to sustain your interest? And I was angry with my teachers for giving me voice and choice because I wanted to play the compliance-based game of school. Well, I ended up choosing the integration of baseball, and I fell in love with the topic. I read every book I could. And back then, to read articles required navigating the dark art of microfilm and microfiche. It was a nightmare. It was slow. Everything cost money. You had to wait for a book to arrive. It was a messy process, but it was also powerful. I gained confidence, adaptability. I learned how to communicate. I learned how to ask meaningful questions. I learned how to do genuine research. I interviewed all of these former baseball players. I was telling the story of the integration of baseball. I learned that history doesn't have one simple narrative. There's multiple interpretations. And the end result of that was a simple slideshow, but it made me feel visible. It made me feel seen. It gave me creative confidence. And I actually joined the competition. There was a competition connected to it. I got to go to the district competition, the state competition, and eventually the national competition. And the freedom to make mistakes, the ability to iterate and improve. I always say, that my teachers gave me slack so I could develop grit, right? They let me make mistakes so I could grow. And again, that project changed my world forever. It's why I became a teacher. It's why I believed in project-based learning. And although it wasn't always pleasant, it was powerful.
Very cool. So you kind of developed this love for project-based learning out of your own experience, and it has become essentially your life's work. But along the way, you've seen what works and what doesn't. We've kind of talked about what this thing is. But if I'm an educator and I'm listening to this interview and I'm saying, I've always wanted to do project-based learning. I've tried it maybe in fits and starts in my classrooms, but I'm getting down with what you're saying, which is the future is going to be a lot different than our present. We need to teach kids to think for themselves, to work in a project-based way, because their reality is going to be much different than our reality, particularly 5-10 years from now. What should I be doing in my classrooms and in my pedagogy to sort of change my mindset to get ready for this reality that I'm trying to create?
So I think the very first thing to do is to say, what is the most low risk way to do this, right? We're coming up on the end of the school year. Do something when testing season is over, when it's a little more low risk. Do something that's going to lead up to a break. Be willing to try those new things and to recognize it's not going to go perfectly the first time. Look, I understand the high stakes world that we're in. I understand the challenges. And so I would say the very first thing is start off at a time when you have the permission yourself to make mistakes, because you will. It takes time to get it right. It's not the same as learning a new vocabulary strategy or a new close reading activity. This is a different way of teaching. And then I think the second thing is to really make sure that when it comes to PBL, you are designing it in a way that is structured. So one of the reasons why PBL fails so badly is that students are experiencing cognitive overload, right? So there's too much extraneous cognitive load. It's a little bit like when you lift weights, if you hold a not so heavy weight for too long, it's eventually going to fatigue your muscles, right? It's going to wear you out. Same thing happens. So reducing the cognitive load, what does that mean? Breaking your project up into phases, making sure that you have predictable protocols that students are using, making sure that you have proper assessments along the way instead of just at the end, making sure that you are still following accommodations for English learners and for neurodiverse students, special ed, all of that, and really making sure that the students know where they're going so that they can be successful. One of the things that I made, the mistakes I made early on in PBL is I didn't provide enough structure and students procrastinated, right? Well, they're not going to procrastinate if there's deadlines built in throughout it, right? If they know, we're doing this today and tomorrow, and then we're going to do checkpoints. And so I think making it feasible for yourself.
That's really cool. I want to ask you about two things. One, and these are both things that I just heard on a recent trip when we were talking to people about how to integrate different frameworks for things like project-based learning in their classrooms, or redesigning instruction for more individualized pedagogy, individualized instruction for students, digitizing instruction. All of these sort of like newish ideas. And one thing that the pushback we always get is like, well, we have, standards, right, that we have to teach to. We have things that we have to do. So how do we fit sort of this new thinking and these new ideas inside these sort of traditional required boxes? Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you talk with educators about that struggle?
Yeah, so I always say PBL isn't about adding something to your plate. It's about rearranging your plate, right? And so it's the notion of combining those standards in a way that builds something entirely new. There's a lot of ways that we can do that. One of the things that we can do is pick out our core power standards that we really want students to master and build your project on those standards. Second thing that we can do is we find those linking standards that we want, and we link those standards. And so the way that I like to think about it is, you could look at all of the ingredients that go into a cake and say, how am I going to cook up each of these things individually? This is overwhelming. We're spending time on flour here, eggs here, this, there, that. Or we could say, wait a second, eggs and flour go together. Like sugar goes with it. And we end up, baking a cake, right? And I know it's a simple metaphor, but it's really the notion of layering the standards on top of each other. I think about that teacher who did the math board game project. What was she doing? They were practicing over and over again probability. And she still did some handouts, some worksheets. She still did some direct instruction, but they were applying and practicing the math by designing this. But then at the same time, incorporating all of those language arts standards that are essentially topic neutral, right? The reading standards, the research standards, the writing standards. And so in the end, this interdisciplinary way ended up saving time. If you watch the students, they looked relaxed. And it's because instead of this isolated, we're doing this standard today, and then we have to move to that standard tomorrow. And it's a different way because you're blending them together.
That's really cool. This notion of like, you have this list of standards that are essentially on a piece of paper or in a strategic plan, wherever they might be. But this idea that you can take something like project-based learning and actually inject like breath and life into these standards so that they become organic and just part of the project that you are creating. That's a really cool idea. I hope people will hear that and kind of start to think about how that might look in their classrooms. I think another piece I heard you mention was around this notion of assessment. And then this is something that like we hear from folks all the time too. Like people lean into these ideas. They like them. They see these concepts demoed in classrooms when they are in their own schools and they're looking at those teachers who are doing things differently, or they're traveling around to conferences. They're hearing from people like you, and they're like pretty excited about this stuff. They bring it back and then they say, I love this idea. How do I make sure that it's working so when my administrator comes knocking on my door, or it's review time or whatever, I can show them not only have we been teaching to the standards, but we've been seeing some success. And it's not just anecdotal, because I'm sure when you walk in and you see the kids up doing stuff around the classroom, it's exciting. But now you need to tie it to something that says like, hey, we did this and it's working. Look how much better these kids are performing this year. Mm-hmm. What does that look like?
So I think it really revolves around the idea of making sure that you have the data to back it up, right? And so you're using those formative assessments, the rubrics, whatever it may be. It could even be that you do a couple of multiple choice tests, right? That's a great way to increase recall. And you're gathering that data and you're demonstrating with the data, hey, look, this project isn't just some fun activity. They're actually mastering the standards at a deep level. And, any kind of rubric that shows the depth of understanding becomes helpful there. And again, I think gathering that data is really important, but also setting the tone ahead of time with your leadership to say, I want to try this and it might not work perfectly. Like I said, we're going to choose a low risk time. I'm going to gather the data and see what worked and what didn't work. I'm not going to go full-blown PBL all the time, right? I'm going to start off small. And, a lot of administrators love the concept of piloting. So you say, look, I want to pilot something different. We're just going to see how it works. And so gathering that data, seeing if it works. And look, the reality might be that you say, for my subject area, for these set of standards that I'm doing, a project was not ideal. It might be the case, right? So, I mentioned standards just a second ago. Skill-based repetition standards don't work well for projects. So I would never go project-based for phonics and blending, for example. Learning how to read should be systematic. It should be step-by-step. It's very different, right? It's hard to do a meaningful project when learning two-step equations and linear equations. Not great. In those moments, little design sprints can work really well. Little tiny mini projects that you do over 1 or 2 class periods, those can be a great thing. But bigger conceptual ideas, that's what works well with projects. And then because it's that, we can really design our assessments in a way that ask, did they learn this at a deep level?
Can you give me an example of like some questions that would lead you to understand, did they learn this at a deep level?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think about is, let's say it's social studies and they're learning about the causes of World War I, the impact of World War I, how it changed the world, what the experiences were like. And maybe their project is that they design a World War I museum. They find that people really don't think much about this war, and it was devastating. So they come up with a powerful metaphor. They design these exhibits. They invite the community in to be a part of it. But what would it look like to assess it? At a basic level, you could have a question like, how did World War I change society? How did it change our world? And then you can have a rubric that really looks at, do the exhibits demonstrate that level of understanding of, wow, it changed art, it changed culture, it changed ideas, worldviews, things like that. Or how well do they understand the causes and the way that those causes are interconnected of, imperialism and nationalism and all these causes of World War I. And you can have them during their project just do a really quick concept map. And again, you're looking for depth of understanding both in the visual of the concept map, but also can they explain those relationships? And some of those might be the types of common assessments you would give during a typical unit, right? A concept map, for example. But now you're looking at, are they demonstrating mastery at a deeper level?
That's really cool. And I think that that's the piece that it was sort of the aha moment for me. And hearing you talk about this was like, yeah, you can design a really cool project and kids can kind of pick in some cases their own project. It's pretty easy when you think about the cake metaphor to layer in the things you need to do in order to meet standards. But the aha moment, at least for me, in hearing you talk about this, is about like, okay, what does this look like in terms of assessment? How can I demonstrate that not only was this fun and engaging and super cool because the kids are up and they're really passionate about the project that they've chosen, but that it's demonstrating the knowledge and sort of the causal sort of relationships that they can explain. To me, it's like, wow, this done this way because it feels so organic. It's almost like in some ways you forget that you're learning, you're in the classroom, right? Because you're so into this thing. But then the output on the other end is like, oh my gosh, look at how much I learned. I can't believe that not only can I been able to illustrate, let's just say World War I, maybe it was a battle in World War I and what happened in this battle, but not only what happened, but also like what resulted from this conflict. How has it changed society? I think that is such an interesting thing. And I mean, I've seen it happen, in classrooms. I've been all over the world sort of watching this thing unfold. And I'm just excited to hear you sort of explain it. I know that you are planning an actual group this fall. Some folks might like to join if it's something that they're interested in. Project-based learning, again, is a big topic, but I think this notion of how do we use it to solve or to help prepare students for what is a changing future, and how can educators implement it with fidelity in knowing that not only are they going to do projects, but they're going to get tremendous, if done right, outputs on the other end from their students and their ability to, just understand and talk about these concepts at a deeper level. Can you tell me about that group? Because I'm sure some people would like to get involved.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I have done is I've looked at all of the mistakes I've made over the years in doing PBL, and my goal is to save you from some of those mistakes, right? To allow the growth process to be a little faster for you if you're doing PBL. My goal really is, how do we make PBL work? Not just to hope it works, but actually use best practices. So what I focused on is, based on my own experiences, based on observing classrooms, like you said, Corey, all over the world, visiting classrooms, seeing what works from other educators, and then distilling it down into this notion of feasibility. So in this process, we cover everything from how we align it to the standards, how we plan it, how we figure out the time factor that becomes so important, how we design protocols to make sure everyone in the group actually works, right? So you don't have one kid doing all of the work. How do we get them to own more of the process in terms of project management, things like that? How do we make sure there's authenticity built into it? And the way that I've done it is I call it PBL by design. PBL is the pedagogical framework, right? We're learning through a project. Design thinking is the creative framework. And so we want to use design thinking, which is something that is used in the arts, it's used in engineering, it's used even in nonprofit spaces. So we're going to use something that people actually use in life that will mirror the type of thing that they use outside of the classroom. And, as I think about, you mentioned the future, when you think about a world of AI, there are things that humans always do better than AI. Like, you can train an AI to be pro-social. You can't train it to empathize. Design thinking develops empathy, of perspective taking, the ability to see what other people are seeing, feel what they're feeling. AI doesn't do context well. It is a large language model that cannot read the room. guess what? Authentic PBL rooted in design thinking, it's going to connect to the context. And what I love about it is instead of using surveillance to be AI resistant and to ensure, that no one's cheating, what you're doing is you're designing the project itself to be built on these human factors that AI cannot replace. And so you give them a compelling reason why they should be working rather than just putting something in a chatbot. And the goal is to be feasible, it's to be fun, it's to design something over the course of each of these modules that we do together. And with the end result being you have something fully fleshed out that you can use a full PBL unit.
Yeah, full unit. I think that's really cool for folks that are interested in this to be able to not only learn about these concepts, but to, through the course of this experience, be able to map out a full unit that they could actually start to deploy in their classrooms. And again, start to test. As you said, it might not be the perfect thing right away, but as you test over time and you find some space to do that, the end product that you come up with could potentially revolutionize how you view teaching and learning in your own classrooms. I think that is super cool. That's probably a great place for us to, John, to wrap this conversation. I would tell folks, if you guys are interested in learning about the group John's pulling together this fall and you are watching this on YouTube, I'll put the link down below in the comments. If you are listening on Spotify or Amazon or wherever you get, your favorite pods, that's cool. Just go to www.rocketpd.com. Click on that button there that says 2025 cohorts, and you can see what John's up to, and you can join us. John, I just want to say thank you again for spending a few minutes with us. This notion is so interesting, this idea that the world is changing faster probably than it ever has, particularly with AI, as you mentioned. But it will be those individuals who use that empathy and that human thinking to leverage those technologies who will be very successful. I think there's always this notion of will AI replace us or this or that? But the reality is it's going to be those kids who learn how to leverage this technology, who learn how to use their thinking and their empathy, who are going to be the ones who succeed. And so I'm excited for that. I hope you are too. I just want to say thank you again. And I hope we'll have you back real soon because I know this topic keeps changing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks a lot. I'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody. And we'll talk to you real soon.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rocket PD podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the Rocket PD podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for Rocket PD. At Rocket PD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at rocketpd.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.